Chicago says it wants affordable housing. Then why is it that every time there's a chance to make housing a little bit cheaper, a little bit more flexible, politicians suddenly hit the brakes? Because that is exactly what happened with Chicago's accessory dwelling unit debate. Coach houses, basement apartments, attic units, granny flats, whatever you want to call them. This was one of those moments where the city had a very real chance to make it easier to add more housing without building giant luxury towers all over the place. And instead of going all the way, Chicago politics, what Chicago politics loves to do, it watered the whole thing down. Now, before I get into the names, let me make this simple. An ADU is basically a small extra housing unit on a property. Maybe it's a coach house out back, maybe it's a basement apartment, maybe it's an attic conversion. And whether you love the idea or hate it, here's the bigger point. These are the kinds of smaller housing options that can help regular people. A family member could live there. A homeowner could create some rental income. A neighborhood could add housing without tearing everything down and replacing it with something massive like an entire development. So when politicians say they care about affordability, this is exactly the kind of policy fight you should pay attention to. Because this is where you find out who actually wants more housing and who just wants to say that they do. Mayor Brandon Johnson pushed back for expanding these units citywide, and honestly, on the core issue, he had a point. Chicago is a major housing affordability problem. Even Johnson himself framed this as part of a city that is tens of thousands of affordable units short. So the idea was simple. Make it easier to build these smaller units across Chicago, not after months of begging and not after getting bounced around by local politics. Just make it legal by right across the city. That is the key phrase here, by right. Meaning if your property qualifies under the rules, you do not need your alderman acting like the final boss. That is where things got interesting, because Alderman Marty Quinn and others who agreed with him pushed back hard. And this is where I want to be fair. Quinn did not come out and say, "I hate affordable housing." That's not what happened. What he said basically was that this would hurt the character of bungalow belt neighborhoods, create problems with parking, garbage, noise, and weaken local control. And if you're someone watching this who agrees with that, that's fine, and at least that is a real argument. But here is my issue. Chicago cannot keep saying housing is too expensive, then panic every time the solution might actually affect a neighborhood people are used to keeping exactly the same. That is not a housing strategy, that is a controlled opposition. And this is where the story gets even more Chicago. Because back in July, a stronger version of the proposal moved forward. It would have allowed these kinds of units citywide without requiring special permission from city officials. That was the cleaner version. That was the bolder version. That was the version that actually changed the old Chicago tradition of aldermanic prerogative. And if you do not know what that is, it's basically the unwritten rule that the local alderman gets huge influence, sometimes effectively veto power over what happens in their ward. In other words, even if the city says it wants more housing, your local political gatekeeper can still decide not here. And that is exactly the kind of system that makes everything slower, messier, and more political than it needs to be. Then the stronger ADU push got blocked. And eventually what came out the other side was the classic compromise. Yes, Chicago passed an ordinance to expand ADU access. Yes, that is movement. Yes, that is better than nothing. But the final version kept a lot more local political control than housing advocates really wanted. So instead of a clean citywide policy, you get more of a patchwork. In some places, it's easier. In some places, there are more restrictions. In some places, aldermanic approval still matters a whole lot. So the city gets to say, look, we expanded housing options. And critics get to say, yeah, but you still protected the exact political structure that helps choke housing supply in the first place. And honestly, both of those things are true. That is why I think this story matters. Because it's not really just about coach houses. It is about whether politicians actually mean what they say when they talk about affordability. Everybody loves affordable housing in a press release. Everybody loves it in theory. Everybody loves it until it means an extra unit on a block with single-family homes. Everybody loves it until a neighborhood meeting gets loud. Everybody loves it until the people with the most political influence start saying the vibe might change. That is when the excuses show up. Parking, character, noise, control. And again, those concerns aren't fake. People really do care about those things. But if every concern automatically turns into another layer of delay, review, exception, and local power, then let's be honest about what that means. It means affordability is not the top priority. Control is. And to me, that is the real headline. Not that Chicago did nothing. Chicago did do something. The city council voted in September to expand ADUs, and the ordinance is set to take effect in April 2026. So that is not a nothing happened story. It is a they had a chance to do more and politics made it smaller story. And if you're trying to buy a home, rent in the city, help a family member stay nearby, or just understand why housing stays expensive year after year, this is exactly the kind of story you should care about. Because housing does not just get more expensive by magic. It gets more expensive because of choices, because of rules, political incentives. And the constant habit of saying yes in public while building in enough restrictions to make sure the yes never goes too far is really a problem. So here's my take. If Chicago really believes affordability is a crisis, then small additional units should not be treated like some radical threat. They should be one of the easiest yeses on the board, not the only solution, not one very obvious solution. And the fact that even this gets watered down tells you a lot. It tells you how hard it is to add housing in a city where politicians still want to talk about affordability while protecting the power to slow it down block by block. That is why I do not buy the clean political talking points. Show me the actual policy, show me who fought it, and show me what actually changed. Then we can talk about who is serious and who's just performing. So what do you think? Should Chicago make it easier to add coach houses, basement apartments, attic units across the city? Or should aldermen and neighborhoods keep more control? Even if that means less housing gets built, because that is the real fight. Not, do you support affordable housing? Everybody says yes to that. The real question is, what are you willing to change to get it? And in Chicago, that is where things get very interesting.